very focused on procedure. And, I say that because I know that the truth and the understanding of real life situations, real life emergencies are unique to each of us. And the types of emergencies, the types of disasters that many of you will deal with are very different from what I would be dealing with here in Chicago. The magnitude, the duration, and the extent of those challenges can be very different from institution to institution. But some of what I'll present today on institution preparedness is really intended to be universal. It's intended to be general and fairly non-specific so that some of the structure that we talk about today can be adapted and utilized for different institutions in different settings. So I want to just kind of briefly cover a few of our objectives for today. We want to talk about some of the major disaster risks that are facing the facilities that are represented here today. And like I said, the cases from the field, the stories from the field yesterday did a great job of encapsulating the breadth and diversity of those types of challenges. Everything from wildfire to flooding to loss of power and public health challenges can face us. We saw this with not only weather disasters, but there's similar challenges that were faced um, with the COVID outbreak or other disease outbreaks where institutions may have to change their operating practices to accommodate for an unforeseen challenge. We'll talk a little bit about how a facility can develop specific disaster preparedness and response plans that are unique to your facility, and importantly, how those disaster plans should constantly be evaluated and refined and revised um, because a plan makes sense on paper or in a presentation doesn't necessarily mean it makes sense in action. And an important part of those plans is to be able to review and revise plans. We'll talk about the principles of triage and evacuation and continuity of care during animal emergencies, how we can strengthen staff safety, communication, and in many cases, interagency coordination. These types of large-scale responses are not unique and limited to one facility, one organization, but require cooperation between multiple different both government and community agencies. And then we'll talk about how we integrate disaster preparedness into routine operations to establish long-term resilience planning. So why are we talking about this? Why do we need to prepare? I think many of our speakers so far have already talked about why this is critical. But as we see, there's an increasing frequency and severity of disasters. We know this with increasing severity and extent of natural weather-related disasters. But even things like political unrest, emerging diseases, climate change can all affect the need for a facility to be adaptable and to be able to come up with new strategies. The facilities we work with and the species we work with provide unique challenges and vulnerabilities. We're already talking about facilities that handle the most critically injured and ill animals of a very delicate species or group of species. In many cases, these centers may be remote from the um, urban centers and thus distant from our ready resources. And the consequences of inadequate planning, both for our staff and for our animals, can be immense. If we don't have adequate plans in place, the risk of animal injury or death becomes higher. Staff injury or potentially staff death becomes higher. The chance of disease outbreak throughout a institution can increase, leading to long-term consequences. There can be loss of infrastructure. Landslides, flooding, fires can damage power, damage water sources, damage housing for the animals, and that loss of infrastructure can make it really challenging for an institution to be able to safely care for those animals during the crisis and then afterwards. And I think we all know that one of the main reasons that we all focus on the species we focus on is their importance for conservation. The impacts of the loss of even an individual animal can have catastrophic impacts for the conservation of a species. And when we talk about dozens or hundreds of orangutans that may be affected, both in the free-ranging setting as well as in a rehabilitation center, the risk of loss there can have immense impacts and disastrous effects on the conservation of those animals. I think some of our field veterinarians have discussed some of the natural hazards that are here, and some of these are unique uh, to the environment in which each of the centers may be housed, and some of these may be unique to other parts of the world, but all of these represent different types of unforeseen and sometimes unpredictable catastrophic natural hazards that can affect the stability of a facility and the safety of its animals. In addition to the natural disasters, we also have to remember that human-caused emergencies can affect supply chains. They can affect resource delivery. They can affect the ability to move staff and animals in and out of a facility. Things like armed conflict or civil unrest can happen in many different parts of the world, leading to inability to ship in specific pieces of equipment, perhaps food items that need to be transported great distances, even sometimes trucking in water or other essential resources can be affected by armed conflict. Similarly, during times of limited resources, we have to be conscientious that the communities that surround our facilities are also struggling to make connections and maintain resources for the human community. So food supplies and water supplies are not only affected for our animals, but they will be also affected for the communities that surround us. And in those times, it is important to remember that it is a balance between providing those delicate resources, those valuable resources for animals and for people at the same time. And there may be challenges in diverting resources from a community to an animal facility. We've seen in the U.S. Times when industrial accidents or spills of hazardous materials have resulted in a contaminated water supply, contaminated food supply, or contaminated environment around an animal facility, potentially limiting the ability to move supplies in and out of the facility or directly affecting the health of the animals due to those supplies. Um, Recently in the US, we recently just experienced just secondhand effects from wildfires in neighboring Canada. Smoke from wildfires there, even though we did not experience the fires directly in our area, we did experience the blown through smoke coming from our northern neighbor, affected air quality and affected the ability for our staff to work outdoors, affected the ability for some of our animals to be in outdoor areas. And for many of those species, we had indoor holding available, but in cases where an indoor facility is not available, even airborne contaminants can provide a significant risk to our species. Power failures, obviously, times of resource disruption can result in sometimes prolonged power failures, and understanding what the capacity is of your facility to deal with power failures, whether they be short term in terms of hours or potentially going on for days or weeks, and what alternate opportunities you have to supply needed equipment during those failures is important. I mentioned water already and transportation disruptions, the ability to move both people and animals, but also supplies along major roadways. So when we talk about risk assessment and preparedness, I mentioned there's no universal plan. We talk about the basics of risk assessment and preparedness, but there's many elements that are unique to each facility and maybe even parts of an individual facility that need to be considered when making an emergency response plan. And I think one of the first steps is actual risk assessment and vulnerability assessment. The facility location. When we talk about facilities that are in different climates, we have different environmental and weather-related risks depending on the location of that facility. I include in this also the remoteness of a facility and the closeness it is the closeness to resources and potentially industrial or population centers where transport of resources may be more readily available. The species in the collection, the species that are represented in the center, um, is it are we talking about endangered species, more common species? Are we talking about solely primates? Are we talking about multiple different taxa? Because the needs of the primates, birds, reptiles may all be very different, and their ability to provide for each of those may be very vastly different. Within the species, we also have individuals that have different disease states, different vulnerabilities, potentially different robustness and ability to survive um, adverse events. Building integrity. The physical structures of the facility will can be affected. Some of the shelters may have been newer and built to resist storms. The fire resilience of different buildings should be evaluated, and this is all being evaluated in light of what the known and predicted threats are. If we think that we're in an area where landslide or heavy rains is high likelihood, the ability for the buildings to withstand those weather changes is important. But if we're really talking about buildings that are meant to withstand uh, fire or other types of events, we may be looking at different structural challenges there. How dependent are each of the facilities on external utilities, power, water, gas, and if those utilities are ceased for hours or days or weeks, what are the alternate strategies to make sure that those needs are met? Is there ability to convert to solar? Is there ability to convert to other alternate on-site water supplies? Endemic disease, again, unique to the situation and to the region in which you're working. Um, when we establish a center to maintain animals in managed care, we try to operate in a way that we are limiting the transmission of disease from the surrounding wild spaces to the animals that are in the center, and similarly minimizing the transmission of disease from the animals in our care to their wild counterparts. But endemic disease risk is universal, and when disasters strike, we may have a breakdown in barriers, we may have a loss of biosecurity, and we may have an increased risk of transmission of disease in and out of the facility. And this goes for both human disease and animal disease, right? Where they have the increased risk of waterborne contamination bringing in fecal pathogens, different environmental pathogens that could be coming through contaminated groundwater, both affecting humans and animals that are in a facility. I mentioned biosecurity and then also supply chains. Supply chain disruption we've seen happen due to natural disasters, human conflicts, but even some things as seemingly routine as changes in trade patterns, tariffs, and other socioeconomic factors have affected supply chains and limited the ability to bring in potentially specialized food items and specialized pieces of equipment. So these risk factors are integral in developing emergency response protocols and in developing emergency action plans. So some of the things that we'll talk about for the rest of this talk is the structure of an emergency action plan and some of those components. We'll focus very heavily on what I'll call the incident command structure. We'll talk about some of the roles and responsibilities of individuals within that incident command structure. Um, some of the other parts to figure out there are who makes the decisions, how those people are contacted, and how the chain of communication moves linearly. We'll talk about what things might activate certain parts of a decision tree and how we know that at a certain activation trigger, whether that is the arrival of the weather event, whether that's the potential for a weather event, those things, what types of triggers we'll have for activating our emergency response plans, and then talk some about the checklist that we have in place to make sure that everyone is aware of what the steps are of the process and how those steps are activated, and we make sure that all of the responsibilities are met. We'll talk a little bit about the unique species in our care. We know that when we're talking about prioritization of care for the animals that we are housing, that each animal is very different, and there's differences in how we categorize those animals in terms of risk to the animal and then risk to us. When dealing with great apes, we have the potential for dangerous animals, animals that should they breach original containment or should they come into direct contact with humans may present specific harm of injury. Obviously, when dealing with endangered species, we talk about the value of that individual for the conservation of its species and the importance for being able to maintain those animals. Our neonates, our newborns, even those, especially those that are orphaned, but also those that are still with their mother, have additional disease risks, but also additional nutritional needs, um, husbandry needs in terms of temperature management and safety management within their groups. The sick and injured animals that are under our care, we have to be careful to ensure that we have the ability to maintain treatment and to manage those animals through potentially a move, whether that's a move within the facility or a move off-site, and whether we can provide the same level of care for those animals while they're in transport or during relocation than as when they're in our original facilities. And we may have some animals that are unsuitable for transport. We talked about this in a few of the scenarios yesterday, but we may, in assessment, understand that there are some animals that physically cannot be transported. And if those animals cannot be moved off-site, if a facility becomes unsafe or unusable, is there a way to maintain those animals in their current situation? And is their staff sufficient to provide that care, knowing that some staff may be staying in a facility that is being evacuated to care for animals that are there, and some staff may be traveling with the animals to a different offsite facility. And other situations where an animal that is unsuitable for transport may be left in a facility, either alone or left and released to the surrounding environment to allow it to fend for itself. Evacuation planning has multiple different steps. The first is understanding the trigger of when to initiate evacuation versus shelter in place. I think in most cases, for transient emergencies, things that we expect to be short duration. The goal would be able to maintain resilience and to shelter in place or stay in the facility where we're at, where the facility is known, the containment is known, the resources are known, and the additive risk of moving animals off site is not as high. In some cases, that may not be possible if the facility itself is compromised, if the injury or the environmental disaster is of sufficient duration that the facility will not be able to withstand the threat. We may need to move off-site, which incorporates those transport logistics, um, the the ability to safely contain and move across compromised roadways or waterways to move animals off-site. Are there enough facilities available to you? Are there enough trucks and other means of transport to actually move the animals and the people and the equipment off-site? And if there is not that equipment readily on site at the facility, where will it be sourced from, and how quickly will those pieces of transport be available to us? Do we actually have the caging or containment available to move the number of animals that we have? And I will say that this type of planning, the transport and the cage and crate preparation, these are things that we take into account for even routine transports of animals. So these are precautions that we as animal care professionals, take into account and must document for any animal transport. And so some of it may come as second nature, that we know what types of transports we need, what types of cages and crates we need to move an individual animal, and then we may need to expand that to the movement of dozens or hundreds of animals. Route planning, understanding what hazards are along the path from our current site to the intended new home for the animals and the staff, and whether there are safe and effective roadways to get us from point A to point B. And if we're committed to one specific route, if there are alternates for us to be able to move those animals and how those routes are determined. And then what are the resources at the destination facilities? This is a destination facility where we have the autonomy to be able to set up and move operations. Is this a space where we are utilizing space from another institution, another organization, and we have to understand their needs and their responsibilities for the staff and the animals they may have on site there, and how will we manage to provide the care to two sets of animals or potentially even more when we're consolidating animals. Those destination facilities must also take into account their own safety resources and biosecurity with the introduction of new animals and new staff. There are veterinary considerations that go into all of this. In many cases, when we're talking about emergency evacuation of animals, we're potentially talking about the risk of emergency anesthesia and sedation. If we have animals whose containment facilities have been compromised, where the risk of containment is lost, or the safety of containment is lost, those animals may present escape risks, where emergency anesthesia and sedation must be utilized to minimize the risk of uh, animal escape or human injury. But even in the best of circumstances, we may be talking about animals that have to be anesthetized to be transported. And are there enough staff? Is there enough equipment to be able to provide emergency container to a vehicle to a new site? And when those animals are moved, are there enough staff to be able to monitor those animals and provide the care that they need while they're under sedation and anesthesia? If there are not, in many cases, that most facilities, even the largest, will not have the staff available to provide um, that type of anesthesia and monitoring for every animal, and then it becomes an element of tiering and prioritizing which animals will require that type of emergency sedation and anesthesia for immediate evacuation versus which animals will be maintained on site for longer durations of time. Is there enough supply or cache of drugs that provide the medical care for these animals? When removing animals off site, is there able to provide the necessary antibiotics, pain medications, even the medical supplies, bandaging materials, fluids, those kind of things? Are those items that have enough within enough supply that if you had to shelter in place and be without resources for days or weeks, that there's enough there that you can provide continuous care for the animals? And if not, are there ways that that type of supply can be brought in short notice to be able to supply and restock a facility to allow it to shelter until a disaster uh, has passed? Even some of the more uh, some of the less urgent items, some of the more administrative items are critical to maintain too in these types of emergencies. Things like medical records and identification systems. When we start moving animals from one facility to another, the ability to track that animal's individual medical history and even to potentially uniquely identify the animal may be limited um, based on the emergency and the need to move those animals offsite. Are there ways to access either paper or electronic medical records in a way that we can provide continuity of care during the transport and during relocation to a new facility? Um, if you rely on electronic medical records, are there redundancies that are in a paper form that can be utilized for transport, or are there ways that electronic medical records can be backed up to a cloud system so they can be accessed from a distant site? Similarly, um, are the animals' unique identifiers easily accessible? Do we know the animals just based on the enclosure in which they're housed? Do we know them by individual appearance? Do they have some sort of permanent identification that allows us to continue um, to to uniquely identify individual animals so we can provide the same level of care? And then I mentioned biosecurity during transport. We may have animals that are suffering from respiratory disease, where we want to maintain separation of ill animals and healthy animals from one another, so that they are not at risk of cross-contamination. And then when we're talking about placing those animals in the same transport um, facility, a same transport truck, or potentially commingling them in a new scenario, are we potentially adding the risk for disease outbreak and disease spread? And I think we've mentioned this in a little bit, but I do think this bears some emphasis here as well as in many parts of this workshop, is that as we care for the animals, these animals during disaster, it's important to make sure that we're caring for ourselves and for our staff. Um, and in terms of emergency management, we're really looking at, do we have the resources to make sure that our staff are able to maintain their own health during an emergency? An emergency that knocks out food supplies, water supplies, potentially uh, increases the risk for human injury. Do we have do we have a sufficient supply of personal protective equipment, whether that's respiratory protection, appropriate boots and clothing, gloves, all of the things that we require to keep humans safe? Do we have those in adequate supply to make it through this critical period? Do we have enough staff? And and when we are limited on staff, do we have a mechanism in place for managing the challenges that these situations could pose in terms of fatigue, burnout, and exhaustion? During an emergency, we may be talking about staff that are being asked to work continuously, 24 hours a day, sometimes multiple days on end, without opportunity for break. And do we have opportunities there for staff to either be able to rest, or do we have abilities for staff to move from critical high need positions to lower need, lower intensity positions during a regular cycle? We can't constantly ask our staff to be performing at 100% or 100, 200% during situations of emergency. And when they are being asked to provide that exceptional level of care, do we have opportunities for them to take a break and move into areas that may be a little less intensive and allow someone else to step up and take the lead for a period of time? During these extreme weather events, heat can definitely affect the health of our animals, but also affect the health of our staff. And when we're limited in our access to air conditioning or potentially even water, the potential for heat exhaustion, illness, or potentially even um, uh, death could be significant. We know that these cases, these disasters, can have considerable impacts on our mental health. We may have animals that we've cared for years that are now put in extraordinary circumstances where their health is being compromised. The risk of death for animals is increasing. There's the additive stress of being able to, of needing to work outside of your comfort zone and work in new and novel situations. And all of this takes an extreme toll on the mental health of the providers that are being asked to provide this level of care. There's increased risk of zoonotic disease, both from the animals at the facility, but now also wild animals that may have access to the area. Contaminated groundwater, contaminated food may also provide additional opportunities for zoonotic disease transmission. With loss of refrigeration or challenges in food supply, foodborne illness, food contamination, bacterial diseases can also increase. Now we're also talking about situations where we're dealing with ill and injured animals and then potentially ill and injured people. And are we able to provide that level of care to the staff who may need to shelter in place away from access to hospitals and other human medical care? So this all kind of lays the ground for how we develop what we call an incident command structure. And an incident command structure is an overarching structure that provides some degree of consistency and continuity for how the unpredictable can become more predictable and more coordinated. The incident command structure, or I'll abbreviate it as ICS for ease, establishes one clear chain of command, and that's one of the central tenets of the incident command structure is understanding whose roles or what each individual person's roles are, and what the definition of those roles might be, and how each of the roles communicates with each other. The goal is to eliminate the confusion about who serves in what role and what each role does. We want to improve communication, knowing that in emergencies, the typical communication strategies may be challenged when we're relying routinely on cell phone and WhatsApp and email. But if we lose service, how do we maintain those types of communications and alternate strategies for communication? In many cases, the incident command structure allows the coordination between multiple agencies. So one individual center may be able to coordinate with community agencies, governmental agencies, disaster relief organizations, as well as other centers that are facing similar challenges. The ICS prioritizes life safety. It's maintaining the safety of the individuals who are providing care above all else. And there's individuals who are within that structure who are responsible for making sure that the individuals underneath them or reporting to them are still safe and effective. And in our animal facilities, we want to maintain animal welfare, right? So it is critical that there are subject matter experts, those being veterinary experts, animal care experts, who can take the role of protecting animal welfare. We want to be able to utilize resources efficiently, knowing that in many cases, the length of a outage or the length of a disaster may be unknown. And so we have to be able to utilize the resources efficiently so that we don't exhaust a limited supply of resources if we're going to need to utilize them for potentially days or weeks. And it also facilitates documentation and recovery. In some cases, at least in the US, when we are facing environmental hazards, there are opportunities for governmental support to help recoup some of the financial losses that were incurred, and being able to document what challenges the institution faced is really critical. Documentation is also important because, as we mentioned a few times, being able to survive one disaster does not necessarily mean you won't be faced with another disaster in the future. And being able to document resources on paper, and understand the strategies that worked, the strategies that did not work, the equipment and the resources that were lost or damaged helps to understand what is needed to be able to fully recover from that one disaster, but then to also be able to plan for the next potential challenge, and to be able to have resources in place to be able to learn from the lessons that you faced, and be able to build on those, be able to take the challenges, the unforeseen circumstances that you overcome, and be able to utilize those in the future. So some of the core principles of the incident command structure that, again, as I mentioned, are intended to be universal, regardless of the challenging situation, is common terminology. Can everyone utilize the same language? Are positions and operations named similarly? So when we're talking about communicating between agencies, between institutions, are you using the same terms and terminology so that everyone knows what each role in operation is? Is there some sort of a unified command structure, especially when working with multiple agencies? If a center is communicating with the local community or with a government, is there a unified leadership structure that allows multiple agencies to work together and to coordinate resource allocation and leadership? What is the span of control? And by this, I mean when an individual is charged with leading a part of an incident response, how many people is that person in charge of? In typical incident command structures, we're talking about a supervisor managing only a small handful of staff, 3 to 4, or 3 to 7 staff reporting directly to them, so that one individual is not charged with managing the needs and responsibilities of dozens of direct reports. When one individual is asked to manage too many underlying staff, the opportunity for that one individual to closely monitor what is happening with those staff is compromised, and that's when mistakes are made and things may be overlooked. The incident command structure is also meant to be modular. Meaning that it can grow in size or it can shrink depending on the incident. So some incident command structures really only require 2 to 3 people, and some may require dozens to manage an incident of a large scale. And then the incident command structure also is charged with producing the incident action plan. What are the operational objectives for each operational period? What are the goals to be able to get the group through the next hour? What are the goals to be able to get the group through the next day and week and month? I'll reference back to this diagram a few times. I've provided this diagram and some explanations in some of the electronic handouts that I've provided for all the attendees. And we'll see these terminology in this kind of flow chart in many different documents referring to incident command structure, right? And this is we'll go through and we'll break out each of these different groups in a little bit more detail, so we'll have an understanding of what is being asked of the incident command, as well as the different items under the command staff and then the general operating staff. So just to briefly review some of these concepts, the ICS is a standardized approach to incident management that is used for all kinds of incidents by all types of organizations and all levels of government or non-governmental agencies. ICS actually works best if you apply it to small incidents as well as large and complex ones. I think when we think about something as intimidating as an incident command structure, we think about it only in the situations of extreme need. But if incident command structures and those reporting chains are utilized on a daily basis for even small incidents, even planned incidents, the terminology, the reporting chains become second nature, and it makes it much easier for us to expand those to larger events. It allows us to have a coordinated response amongst the various jurisdictions and agencies, and establishes common processes for incident level planning and resource management. The goal is to allow for the integration of resources such as facility, equipment, and personnel within a common organizational structure. And so I'll give the example, at a zoo where I work in a very controlled situation and with more routine practices. We'll utilize an incident command structure for many different things. We'll utilize it for emergencies, such as an animal escape, a fire, or an extreme weather event. But we'll also utilize it for large events that are happening at the zoo, where we may be predicting that we'll have a large influx of guests, a large influx of visitors to the zoo, and we need to have different strategies in place to be able to manage the crowd control, be able to provide safety for that increased influx of visitors. And we'll utilize the same terminology. We may have an incident commander who oversees the emergency response for a human injury, but we may also have an incident commander that is overseeing a large planned guest event. For our animal transports, when we're moving animals in and out of a facility, we have a similar but scaled down incident command structure where we know who is the commander who's overseeing the aspects of the overall management and aspects of the animal transport. We also know who is in charge of the individual parts of the animal transport, whether that's the anesthesia and the immobilization, the crating and the loading of an animal, and then the driving and the transport of those animals. So, again, these are situations which we deal with every day. Common situations where we may be utilizing something that is very similar to this ICS structure, but we're not necessarily calling it that. And as soon as we start to see that organizational structure we use for routine practices can be expanded to emergency practices, the less intimidating this may become, and the more routine it may become for us to utilize a similar structure. The ICS can and should be used to manage any type of incident, like I mentioned, planned events and unplanned events. And it can be applicable to incidents regardless of their size or the cause. ICS remains extremely useful, though in some cases it may not be immediately intuitive. It provides organizational structure, but also guides the process for planning, building, and adapting that structure. And as I said, utilizing the incident command structure for every incident or planned event provides the practice that will help to maintain and improve the skills needed to coordinate larger or more complex events. If you're utilizing these types of structures, if you're utilizing this reporting chain for even small and planned events, it helps make it more second nature and more easily applicable to larger unpredictable events. At ICS, it clarifies chain of command and the supervision responsibilities with the ultimate goal of improving accountability. We want to know who is in charge of what parts of the process so we know who we can rely on to execute those processes. It leverages the existing communication systems and utilizes plain language to improve communications. Right? We want to focus on consistent communication and plain language. I'm not sure how institutional communication happens in each of your facilities, but in some of our facilities, we do have the tendency to utilize institution-specific language or industry-specific language, things like codes or shorthand abbreviations, which in times of emergency can become quite confusing, especially when dealing with agencies that are outside of our own institution. So we try to utilize plain, clear, and concise language to allow communication between agencies to be totally transparent without that risk of misunderstanding. The ICS is providing an orderly systemic planning process, utilizing common, flexible, and pre-designed management structure to foster that cooperation between different disciplines and agencies. All right. There are some guiding principles that allow an incident command system to work effectively. I mentioned common terminology, using the same words to mean the same things. That modular organization, so having a framework structure that can be expanded to have additional folks, additional staff, or additional groups added in or removed based on the needs of the emergency. We'll manage by objectives. We'll have different targeted goals based on the time point of the incident. That incident action planning we mentioned. The span of control and the scope of control. What is being asked of each individual leader in that situation, and is it a manageable request? And if not, are there others that can provide additional support? We need to understand the facilities and the locations that we're dealing with to provide comprehensive management of sometimes limited resources. We'll utilize integrated communications, communications between different groups. One of those critical communication points is the establishment and transfer of command. So when we establish who is the incident commander and who is in charge of individual parts of an incident, it's important to know when that responsibility is being assigned, and then as an incident progresses in time, it's important to know that someone may have to transfer command. So somebody may be in charge of the incident, maybe overseeing the general operations, but as time passes on, as exhaustion sets in, as needs change, there has to be a clear and effective way to transfer that command from one person to another. This is incredibly important when we talk about incidents that expand over multiple days, weeks, or months. We talked about unified command when we're talking about multiple agencies working together. Is there a unified central responsible party that can provide guidance and oversight to the different agencies that may be participating? What's that chain of command? How does it directive from one leader make it to the next level down and then be disseminated throughout? And how do we make sure that message is unified and consistent as it goes through that chain of command? I mentioned accountability. When in the emergent situation, if things are not being met, if needs are not being met, who's responsible and how can we make sure that that person realizes that their responsibilities are not being met, and how can they be guided to provide additional levels of support? And then we'll talk about information and intelligence management. How do we make sure that information is being transmitted both internally and externally to external stakeholders? So that modular organization, as I mentioned, the incident command structure utilizes a structure that can be very basic or it can be expanded depending on the size and the complexity of the emergency. Um, the size and the complexity of that structure really is reliant on the incident commander. And we'll talk in the next few slides about the role of the incident commander, that person who's at the top of this chain, whose oversight responsibility is to determine what the roles and responsibilities of those under him or her entail. As the incident grows more complex, the ICS structure is allowed to expand, and different responsibilities may be delegated further down the chain. When we talk about management by objectives, the incident commander establishes incident objectives, and that those objectives drive those operations. Right. And when we say this, we mean those objectives can be, they can be very small, they can be very large. If the objective for the next hour is to be able to provide heat, warmth, and water to a certain section of a facility, that is the objective that is being communicated by the incident commander to the operational groups that provide that will provide that responsibility. Those objectives need to be specific and they need to be measurable. The goal cannot be broad and ill-defined because it makes it much more challenging to delegate tasks if those are not specific, measurable tasks. They have to be time-bound, they have to be identifiable, and have to be easily delegated down. The incident commander also provides strategies, tactics to achieve those goals. Uh, and then in developing and issuing those assignments, plans, and procedures have to help develop the protocols to accomplish those identified tasks. And as I mentioned before, it's important to document the results um, uh, of those individual objectives for further review later on in the emergency or potentially post-emergency so that we can go back and review what objectives were clearly defined, how those objectives were executed, and whether the goals of those objectives were actually met. And in in retrospect, were those the right objectives for us to really be prioritizing? Action planning, incident action planning is a concise and coherent means of capturing and communicating overall incident priorities. This is an overall plan that says what do we need, who's doing it, what resources are needed, and how do we communicate. The incident commander has the overall responsibility for producing that incident action plan, and it should focus on the needs and the future time frame. So, that what we call operational periods, whether that's the next hour, the next week, the next month. They should be proactive. They should include those incident objectives we mentioned in the last slide. We should talk about the activities that need to be completed and how we know that those that completion was met. If the goal is to be able to move 10 animals safely from one side of a facility to another, we know that that goal was met when those animals are safely moved, secured, and assessed to know that there was no injury or illness that was secondary to that movement. Incident action plans assign responsibilities, they identify the needed resources, and they specify the communication protocols that are in place to clearly understand the roles and the next steps that are involved. I mentioned that manageable span of control. What can one person reasonably be expected to handle? In in these situations, do we know how much we can ask of our leaders and of our staff? And part of that is understanding how many individuals one person can be asked to manage. And typically, the ideal situation is one supervisor has 5 subordinates, but this can change depending on the type of scenario, the type of situation. But that allows that one person to only have to oversee the immediate needs of those 5 individuals under him and not necessarily oversee all of the individuals participating in emergency response. The comprehensive resource management again, identifying requirements, knowing what things are needed during what time frames, so we can prioritize when certain resources are needed and when certain resources need to be saved for future use. When there are times where the immediate need may have subsided and we have the opportunity to restock and replenish resources to be able to bring back uh, resources to utilize for the next wave. So if a food item or water is intensely needed and then that need has subsided, do we have the opportunity to restock our facilities to be prepared for the next wave of need? And again, tracking and documentation is critical in these situations. Does integrated communications, utilization of common communication strategies, consistent terminology, and consistent and repeatable communication processes to maintain connection. During these situations, communication is going to be one of the most critical things. An incident command system really needs to be able to effectively disseminate information across multiple levels, and consistent and effective communication is critical. When we have lapses in communication, when we have loss of infrastructure, it's important to know what our auxiliary or secondary methods are going to be to maintain communication. And then I mentioned that transfer of command. Um, the command function should be clearly established at the beginning of the incident. We should know who is in charge and what their responsibilities are. But we should also know that when that person needs to be relieved of command, either due to changes in responsibility, exhaustion, or time, the transfer of command needs to happen. And we need to be able to know who's going to take over. Has that person been properly briefed on what their new responsibilities are going to be? And is the staff that is reporting to that individual, are they aware that now their leadership has changed and they know who they're supposed to be reporting to? And I think this bears importance because in an emergency, leaders want to lead. They want to be there for their staff. They want to be there for their animals. They want to give of themselves, but they also need to understand that a leader can only do so much, and they need to be able to empower those with them and those under them to then be able to take over leadership, even if it is for a short period of time. I think I've covered some of this, the unity of command, but when the chain of command relates to the hierarchy of the organization, unity of command really just means that all individuals have a single designated supervisor, and they're really responsible for reporting to their immediate supervisor, who then reports up that chain of command. Ideally, we really only want one incident command supervisor, and all work assignments should be coming to each individual member from their direct supervisor. In so many cases, when an incident takes place, it may be important to remember that work groups may be disrupted, that individuals may be moved from one area to another, and you may not be reporting to your day-to-day supervisor. You may be reporting to the supervisor for an individual objective. You know, if you're in charge of making sure that food is available for all animals in the facility, you may no longer be providing the individual care to the animals that you were previously assigned to. You may be now moved over to a new task and thus assigned a new supervisor. Those resources should only be sent out when they're specifically requested and dispatched by an authority. So that again is the responsibility of those incident commanders to call for specific resources when they're needed. And this is in order to maintain adequate stocks of resources. We don't necessarily want to deploy all of our resources at the onset of an emergency. We want to be able to maintain a consistent stock, and we know that we're only utilizing certain resources as they are needed to avoid overutilization, potential waste, and overburdening of the staff. Right. We're going to talk a little bit more about the individual roles of the incident command, and I know we're about two-thirds of the way through our time here. So I'm going to some of this will be review and revision or repetition. So I just want to make sure that we're kind of re-emphasizing some of those basic concepts. But when we talk about incident command, we have multiple different functional areas of the incident command that include the oversight in command, the operations, planning, logistics, and the financial administration. Each of these serves an individual role, and they all report up through that command structure. The incident command, the overall incident command sets the incident objectives, the strategies, and the priorities. The operations, this is where many of us as veterinarians will fall into operations, and that we conduct the operations to reach incident objectives. We establish tactics and direct operational resources. The planning groups support the incident by planning the processes, tracking resources, collecting and analyzing information, being able to consolidate information from different sources, and maintaining that critically important documentation. A logistics group may arrange for resources to be moved from place to place to support those institutional objectives. And then finance and administration. There's a need to be able to maintain, to monitor and control the costs of an incident, to be able to make sure that we have the financial resources to see through the end of an incident. And if the financial resources of an organization are being strapped or being expended, that there's ability to call on either partner organizations, NGOs, the government to provide additional support as needed. And if those resources are not established ahead of time, it's going to be very challenging to meet those needs in the moment. So again, this is just that figure that I showed you earlier, talking about those different roles and how those different parts of the operation or general staff fall under the incident command. The incident commander, as I mentioned, is over the overall overarching responsibility. They issue staff assignments and support the incident command function. They have the responsibility for overall safety. They provide information to the internal and external stakeholders, and they establish and maintain liaisons with other agencies that are participating in the incident. That incident commander must utilize one or more different deputies that are underneath them to provide support for those larger incidents. They delegate responsibilities to the groups that are below them, so the operations, planning, logistics, and financial sections. And depending on the size of the incident, these sections may not all be needed. They may only be activated as needed to support a specific incident. So we may only have an incident command and an operations section, and the other items are not utilized for smaller incidents. Some other roles that may be in that command staff, a public information officer is the person who coordinates communication with external public and media. And when we have incidents here at the zoo, we always identify a public information officer who is the voice of the organization so that the incident commander is not charged with talking to the public or talking to the media and being distracted from the duties that are required. A public information officer should have the relevant and important information that is needed to be able to communicate to external interested parties without disrupting the operations of the actual incident response. I have a safety officer who can monitor incident operations and advise the incident commander on matters related to the safety of the staff. We have a liaison officer who can work between the incident command on a on an individual facility and external stakeholders. And the incident commander has the ability to appoint technical specialists such as legal, veterinary, science, to meet specific needs and specific objectives. Every incident management consists of four areas of responsibility: the direct response to save lives, stabilize the incident, and protect property and the environment. The support throughout the incident and in terms of resource acquisition, information gathering, and coordination. Generation of policy and guidance for those senior decision makers. And then outreach and communication with the media to keep them informed of the incident. So those previous slides kind of showed how those different roles are delegated between the members of the command staff. The general staff, so those groups in the darker blue at the bottom that are providing more specific supports for those operations under the incident command. We'll talk about those items that are in operations, plannings, logistics, and finance. As I mentioned, as the incident expands, the incident commander has the opportunity to expand the roles of those different departments, and some or all of those may be consolidated in smaller incidences. The operations section has will implement strategies, develop tactics, and carry out individual incident objectives. They direct the management of all the technical activities on behalf of the incident commander, and they support the development of the incident action plan to ensure that it accurately reflects the current operations. Those operations individuals are organizing, assigning, and supervising the tactical response resources. Um, it's important. The operations section, especially in animal facilities, does include the veterinary and animal care divisions because these are really critical, very technical operations. So it's important to remember that as the technical experts in veterinary medicine and animal care, we have clear and defined needs and objectives that are immediate and operational. And in some cases, the technical expertise that's needed of the veterinary and animal care staff may be more important in the moment providing that immediate care than it is in providing the overall incident oversight. So the ability to have an organizational level incident commander who understands the roles of the individual technical experts is really critically important. And I think as veterinarians and as leaders, we want to be there, we want to be available to lead. But in some cases, our role is more focused on the individual animals and supporting those more focused operations than it is in providing oversight for the whole incident. I mentioned a little bit about those planning sections. They prepare and document the incident action plans. They manage information flow and track resources. The logistics section uh, is really there. The logistics section provides a lot of important resources on prior to an incident actually taking place. These are individuals that will order, obtain, and maintain the essential supplies in advance of an emergency happening. They can provide information on communication planning, provide documents of integral to communication, set up food services for the responders and medical needs and emergency response needs for the staff that are providing emergency care. They can set up transportation and then provide medical services in case of human injury. And then obviously the financial aspects of the incident response are critical for the long-term survivability of an organization. A financial group needs to be able to maintain and understand costs that are associated with the incident response, to be able to understand the staff and the financial resources that are being utilized, and then be able to document what was lost in terms of insurance and governmental reimbursement if those resources are available. All right. Talked a little bit about the veterinary role in the ICS, and just to reiterate, the veterinarian is really critical in a number of different ways. As veterinarians and as leaders, we provide a lot of organizational level leadership, but we also provide technical expertise in triage, chemical mobilization, emergency medical care and surgery, um, disease surveillance, animal transport, in cases of death, necropsy coordination, and then welfare monitoring. We want to be those technical experts that are assuring the care, health, and welfare of the animals throughout that whole event. And they can advise an incident commander on specific animal risks, threats to public safety from animal-induced injury or animal-induced disease, and zoonotic disease. They can discuss euthanasia decisions if those become necessary, as well as elements of biosecurity and quarantine. And regardless of who's providing the leadership, there's elements of good leadership that are critical and universal. A good leader must be able to communicate by giving specific instructions and asking for feedback. They need to be able to effectively supervise the scene of action without needing to manage the individual tasks that are underneath them. They need to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of a plan, and they need to be able to understand the needs to modify an individual plan. They ensure safety of the workplace. They take command of the assigned resources that are available to them, and they motivate their staff by having a positive attitude, but really emphasizing safety and well-being for the staff to allow them to be able to move through a challenging situation. And they need to demonstrate initiative by being able to take action and move forward. A leader must be committed to excellence in all their aspects and provide professional responsibility. They should know, understand, and practice those responsibilities in their day-to-day activities and have a commitment to duty, respect, and integrity, and to value the individual contributions that are provided by each individual member of their team. They have to be committed to fulfilling all of their duties, to be able to take charge and execute within the scope of their authority. In some cases, a technical expert may have to step out of their technical or tactical role and assume a leadership role, um, but also be proficient in their job. They have to be able to make sound and timely decisions, ensure tasks are understood and well communicated, and that when tasks are completed, that information is being relayed back to all responsible parties. And they also have to be able to develop future leaders and their subordinates for future events, right? One strong leader is only one individual. The most important thing a strong leader can do is to be able to develop leadership skills in those that are working with and for them. Um, you need to be able to know who's with you, who's on your team, and to be able to look out for their well-being. Know that not all individuals are going to succeed equally, but they all deserve respect. And we know that each um, uh, is each individual in that team has a unique role, and that the supervisor must be able to inform each individual in timely and accurate ways of what their responsibilities are. And then we just need to be able to build that team while making sure that we're checking in regularly to assure that the team is not experiencing fatigue or the physical limitations of the challenge are not becoming overwhelming. An effective leader, when briefing a team, needs to be able to tell them what the task is, or what is to be done, why it is to be done, or what the purpose is, and what the end state or the completion looks like. How do we know when the task is done? What are we going to call completion? All right. We're going to wrap up. We're going to talk a little bit about the assessment process. Assessment is important. Uh, and here we're talking about things like after action reviews. At the completion of an incident, it's important for all the team members to be able to come back and provide an after action review. Um, and some of this may be included in immediate debriefings, or longer term evaluations and assessments in terms of in the form of post-incident critiques, evaluations, review and revision of plans, and then ways that we can mitigate future incidents and disasters. Are there elements that we learned from the response to this plan that we can use to plan for future events? Part of the maintenance of an ICS is training and orientation, routine functional exercises, those after action reviews I mentioned, but then also things like tabletop exercises and full-scale drills. So in a zoo setting, we utilize drills or simulated adverse events to practice what we'll do. So if our goal is to have an effective response strategy for an extreme weather event, we may have drills throughout the year that simulate how we would respond to that weather event, where our staff would shelter in place, where we'd go to find the resources that would be needed should this be a real event. We do this for simulated cases of human injury, for animal escape, for fire, and then, as I mentioned, extreme weather. And by being able to do these drills or doing these simulated events on a routine basis, it builds in your team that institutional communication to be able to work through these types of events, so that you have all of the plans in place in advance of that event actually happening. This includes things like reviewing all of the critical communication points, how we contact the individuals who need to be contacted, who needs to be contacted and when. All right. So we're going to summarize just with some of the priorities for any incident. It's going to be critical for us to be able to protect human life. It's going to be important for us to be able to stabilize the incident and establish command, to protect animal welfare while minimizing the risks to people, to safeguard the critical infrastructure and the conservation assets in terms of the animals and the resources that we have that are within our responsibility to protect, and then to document those actions and to begin planning for recovery and to begin planning for how we will respond better and more comprehensively to each challenge we face. We can have these practical preparation checklists. These are all within the written documents I've provided for you, but these are just a list of some of the things that might go on institutional preparedness checklists. And these checklists should be reviewed and revised after each incident to make sure that they were true and accurate and that there weren't items that were missing from these checklists. Identifying those critical resources, like we mentioned, things like water, electricity, medical supplies, and food. And if those things are not readily available, what are our backup strategies for how we acquire them in times of need? And how do we utilize that planning to build a prepared organization? Remembering that preparedness is an ongoing process, that just because we have a plan in place, it's not just a document on a shelf. This is a living document, a living institutional philosophy to maintain comprehensive emergency response in terms of written policies and protocols, things that are reviewed and revised, routine and continuous staff training, those regular emergency drills or simulated exercises, inspections of equipment to make sure that everything is functional and working. Those routine activities like daily checking of locks, gates, fences, and barriers to make sure that they're able to withstand those emergency responses. And then clearly making sure that staff understand their roles and responsibilities, both in the day-to-day operations of a facility, but also in times of emergency. Um, those planning frameworks, there's a few schemes for talking about planning frameworks, but this is one that I like. It's called a spider framework, where we set goals, we plan procedures, we implement training, document performance, evaluate outcomes, and then constantly readjust, review, and improve. There are many different frameworks to talk about institutional planning. This is just one that sticks in my mind because it has a convenient and very well organized set of objectives. All right, and then I'll just wrap up with just a few things that are unique to our situation. We talked a lot about institutional organizational planning, and that is universal regardless of the type of institution or the type of challenge that we're facing. But we are dealing with delicate, critically important, endangered wildlife, and it is imperative on us as animal care professionals to look out for the welfare of these animals during times of emergency. And we know that there's literature that there are gaps in our knowledge. We know that it is challenging to assess the welfare of these unique species during times of unprecedented tragedy. We know that we need to develop rapid ways for us to be able to assess both their health and their welfare in the field. In some cases, due to extreme injury or resource availability, we may need to be able to have conversations about need for humane euthanasia when the resources are not sufficient to be able to provide the care for an animal, and the choice comes between humane euthanasia or allowing an animal to suffer and die during a case of a extreme need. We have to talk about how effective we can be at continuing to rescue and rehabilitate animals when our resources are strapped. We have to understand, what are the challenges for the long-term survival of some of these animals? Should we need to release them after rehabilitation or even during an emergency situation? And how do we assess the ability to provide emergency food and water supplementation to these animals during times of need? Are we able to provide supplemental feeding to animals that are now in a semi-wild situation? Excuse me. So in conclusion, preparedness helps save both human and animal lives. Every facility requires a written and practiced emergency response plan, and species-specific planning is essential for any wildlife facility. Veterinary readiness includes all of those aspects we talked about, anesthesia, transport, and emergency care, and is central to disaster response. And partnerships are important for us to build early and to maintain often with our partner animal agencies, governmental agencies, NGOs, and our neighbors, neighboring communities to improve operational resilience. So here are a few resources. I'll have a chance to take a few questions now, but I'll also be happy to take questions during the panel that we have scheduled for later.
Thank you, Sathya. Please give applause for Sathya. From the Sathya presentation, I get many things that I can pinpoint, especially for us as a veterinary. Everything can be the disaster if you're not doing the preparedness. So please be careful with that. And we still have 5 minutes on the go. So maybe I will take it one question. If someone, okay, we have question here, Sathya. It's coming from Victor.
Yang pertama tadi terkait, I'm sorry, siapa namanya? Sathya. I speak in bahasa ya, so Yeni can help translate. Terkait evakuasi, jadi kadang seperti natural disaster kita belum punya tempat evakuasi yang sesuai standar. Tadi ada fasilitas air minum, sebagainya, kandang yang aman dan sebagainya. Jadi alternatif fasilitas evakuasi atau pengungsian darurat untuk satwa kita seperti apa? Minimal yang cukup bisa dipraktekkan gitu loh Mbak, bagi pusat-pusat rehab ini. Yang kedua, terkait kalau ada disease outbreak, disaster, apakah ada opsi juga untuk evakuasi atau emang harus kita isolasi di pusat rehab kita? Terus yang terakhir terkait insiden command system, tadi secara struktur cukup kompleks sistemnya. Nah, sedangkan kita di pusat rehabilitasi sendiri kadang jumlah personil kita sedikit. Jadi apakah ada struktur yang lebih kecil tapi efektif, atau memang struktur itu sudah baku dan hanya orang saja, misalnya sedikit orang, jadi satu orang merangkap beberapa tanggung jawab di struktur tersebut.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the translator will be translate for you, Sathya.
Okay, my first question is, if we don't have any standardized evacuation place in our center, do you have any recommendations on emergency shelter with minimum requirements that are applicable in the disaster situation? My second question is,
sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing the translator. I can hear the main microphone, but that secondary microphone I can't hear very well.
Okay. Mbak, apakah perlu switch mic atau bagaimana?
Perlu switch mic. Oh, yeah, waiting. I think we need to switch some mic with the translator.
Okay, hello. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Yes, it's still soft, but I can hear.
Okay, the first question is for if we don't have any standardized evacuation spot or place in our center, do you have any recommendations on the emergency shelter with minimum requirements that are applicable during the disaster time? That's the first question. And the second one is, when we face disease outbreak, do you recommend us to evacuate the species, or is it better to isolate the species in our rehab center? That's the second question. And the third one is, I noticed that ICS is pretty complex. It has quite so many elements. Do you have any recommendations for the smaller or more effective structure? Is it still can be adapted to the smaller and effective structure, or do we need to implement this within this very complex structure? So that's the 3 questions. Can you catch all the questions?
Yes, I think so. I'll start with the third question. The incident command structure can be very complex or can be very, very simplified. And I'm sorry. The incident command structure can be complex or it can be simplified. For smaller institutions or smaller events, it is important to keep it very small and limited so that it's not burdensome. It does not need to be very, very complex, but it just needs to be clear who is overseeing the individual incident and then who's overseeing the individual parts of that incident. So even if it is something small, for example, if we were to deal with an animal escape, we're not going to necessarily utilize all of the components of an incident command structure, but we will have one person who's the incident command structure the incident commander who can delegate tasks and can be a central point of communication for all of the events. But while the veterinarian may be doing chemical mobilization, the transport staff may be coordinating the transport of an animal. We have different parts of that process, but it may only be 4 or 5 people that are involved in that smaller incident, but we still have a very similar structure of individual parts or individual staff members that are representing different areas that are reporting up to one incident commander. But the overall goal is to make sure that there aren't multiple people who are trying to give conflicting orders, conflicting guidance that may slow down a response. We want to have one unified path of communication from incident commander down to the subordinate groups. I think the second question, sorry, I'm going backwards, but the second question was about potential for infectious disease and transmission during an evacuation. And I think some of this depends on the type of infectious diseases that you're dealing with. It may be important to maintain, especially in case of respiratory disease. If we are worried about transmissible respiratory disease, it may be important for healthy animals to potentially be moved out first or be moved to a different facility where they can be maintained clear of those infectious animals, and then maybe have an in-place quarantine scenario that is established where ill or contagious animals can still be maintained in quarantine. And it's challenging because those individual animals each have their own individual needs and welfare to consider, but by potentially moving an infectious animal into a group of healthy animals, we compromise the health of many, many different animals, not just that one sick individual. So it's hard to say because different scenarios will require different needs. But the overall health of the whole group of animals needs to be considered. And if that means that healthy individuals may be provided an isolated environment to be clear of infectious individuals, that may be necessary, knowing that some limited resources may not be available to the sickest of animals. And I think the first question was if you don't have clear quarantine facilities or clear emergency evacuation facilities available, how do we accommodate for that? And I think that is universal. I think it's hard for any institution to be able to evacuate all of the animals to a different facility, and that's where it's important to go site by site within your own facility and determine which areas you think are most vulnerable. Are there areas within your own property, within your own facility, where you feel like there is adequate or better ability to isolate animals or to be able to provide safe housing for them, where if there are more compromised areas or areas on a periphery that would be damaged, that you have the ability to consolidate and move animals into closer environments? Or are there other facilities, neighboring facilities, where you might be able to utilize resources? I think given the distance between a number of the centers, it's also important just to to know if you do need to shelter in place and you do need to be able to maintain care for those animals while remaining on site, do you have enough staff to do that? And do the staff have the resources they need to be able to do that? So it is challenging. Some of these facilities, are already very full and don't have resources to be able to consolidate animals into smaller areas. But as newer facilities are built, or if you have damage to a facility as you're rebuilding, looking into how you can build in additional shelters may be helpful, because as we mentioned before, the next disaster may come and may be worse than the one you've just survived.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for because
Thank
the
you.
time is running out. So please, if you still have a question for Sathya, we still have time to get the discussion together in a panel discussion. So Sathya will coming with us again after lunch. Yeah, before lunch. So thank you, sir. And then thank you, Sathya, for your time. Please get applause for Sathya. And we continue for the next session. This is the case study.